A Tale of Betrayal and Redemption. Part 1. Homecoming. The Texas heat hit Master Sergeant Daniel Dan Harris like a solid wall as he stepped off the military transport at Fort Hood. After 6 months embedded with special forces in an undisclosed location in the Middle East, the humid southern air felt almost alien. His dress uniform, despite the sweltering temperature, remained impeccable. Every crease in place, every button polished. 20 years in the Army had instilled in him a discipline that had become second nature. Dan checked his watch, 2:15 p.m. He had texted Melissa that he would be home around 4 o'clock, giving himself plenty of time to navigate the familiar route to their suburban home in Richardson, just outside of Dallas. He had survived gunfire, negotiated with warlords, and analyzed intelligence that saved countless lives. Yet the butterfly sensation in his stomach as he thought about seeing his family made him feel like a fresh recruit on his first day. The drive was a blur of anticipation. He had missed so much: Justin's basketball championships, Emma's middle school graduation. 6 months was an eternity in the life of a teenager. Justin would be starting his junior year, already talking about college. Emma would be entering 7th grade, that precarious age where childhood begins its reluctant surrender to adolescence. When Dan finally turned onto Maple Creek Drive, he slowed the rental car to a crawl, savoring the sight of the 2-story colonial he and Melissa had purchased 10 years ago. The lawn looked different, more manicured than he remembered, and there was a gleaming black Mercedes SUV in the driveway that he didn't recognize. Melissa must have finally traded in the Volvo, he murmured to himself with a slight frown. They had discussed larger purchases like this before, but he pushed the thought aside. He was home now. Everything else could wait. The house key turned smoothly in the lock. Dan stepped inside, the familiar scent of home washing over him, Melissa's lavender candles, the faint trace of the lemon polish they used on the hardwood floors. "Hello," he called out, setting his duffel bag down in the entryway. "I'm home." The living room television blared at an uncomfortable volume. Some reality show Dan didn't recognize. Justin sprawled across the sectional sofa, headphones clamped over his ears, fingers dancing across his phone screen. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to her tablet. Neither looked up. "Hey guys," Dan said louder, arms spread wide, expecting the rush of embraces he had dreamed about for months. Justin glanced up, his expression flat, almost annoyed at the interruption. He pulled one side of his headphones away from his ear. "Oh, you're back." Emma offered a quick wave without looking up from her screen. Confused, Dan lowered his arms slowly. This wasn't the homecoming he had imagined. Not even close. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. Justin shrugged. "Upstairs, I think." Dan climbed the familiar stairs, noting new artwork on the walls. Expensive-looking abstract pieces that weren't remotely Melissa's style. The master bedroom door was partially open. He could hear Melissa's voice, animated in a way he hadn't heard in years. I know," she was saying, her laughter musical. "He's supposed to be back today, but you know how the military is. Probably delayed somewhere." Dan pushed the door open. Melissa was stretched across their king-size bed, phone pressed to her ear, wearing a dress he'd never seen before. Her hair was different too, highlighted and cut in a sleek bob that framed her face elegantly. She looked up, startled. Her smile vanished instantly. "I've got to go," she said into the phone, her tone abruptly businesslike. "Yes. Later." She ended the call, tossing the phone onto the duvet. "Oh," she said flatly. "You're back." 3 identical words from his wife and son, yet they cut deeper coming from Melissa. Dan stood in the doorway, still in his uniform, the distance between them suddenly seeming like miles rather than feet. "Surprise," he attempted with a weak smile. "Caught an earlier transport." Melissa didn't move to embrace him. She smoothed her dress and sat up, her expression unreadable. "You should have called. The house is a mess." Dan glanced around the immaculate bedroom, noting the new furniture, the designer bedding, the jewelry box on the dresser that hadn't been there when he left. "Looks pretty good to me," he offered, still waiting for some sign of welcome. "New stuff." Melissa stood, slipping her feet into a pair of high-heeled shoes that probably cost more than Dan's entire military-issued wardrobe. You've been gone 6 months, Dan. Life doesn't stop because you're playing soldier in the desert. The words landed like slaps. Dan had been a soldier for their entire marriage. It had never been a point of contention before. He had been analyzing terrorist networks and negotiating peace between tribal factions, not playing at anything. But he swallowed the correction. I missed you, he said simply. All of you. Melissa walked past him to the full-length mirror, checking her appearance with critical eyes. We should talk later. I have dinner plans. Dinner plans? I just got home, Mel. She turned, her expression hardening. Yes, and I didn't know you'd be here. I made commitments. Important ones. The world doesn't revolve around your schedule, Daniel. The use of his full name was telling. Melissa only called him Daniel when she was truly angry. But what could she possibly be angry about? He was the one coming home, too, whatever this was. What about the kids? Have they eaten? Melissa grabbed a designer handbag from the bed. They're teenagers, Dan. They can microwave something or order pizza. There's money on the counter. She brushed past him, the scent of an unfamiliar perfume lingering in her wake. Expensive. Not the subtle vanilla she had worn for years. We'll talk when I get back, she called over her shoulder as she descended the stairs. Don't wait up. Dan stood in the empty bedroom, still holding his service cap, listening to the sound of the Mercedes starting up in the driveway, then pulling away. He slowly lowered himself to sit on the edge of the bed, their bed, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Something was very wrong. The coldness, the new possessions, the dinner plans she couldn't break for his homecoming. Dan had walked into thousands of unknown situations in his military career, trained to detect anomalies and analyze threats. Now in the quiet of his bedroom, those same instincts screamed warnings. His family had changed. Or perhaps they had simply revealed who they had become in his absence. Either way, Master Sergeant Daniel Harris felt a cold certainty forming in his gut. The battle for his home had already begun, and he was starting at a severe disadvantage. Part 2. The New Reality. The next morning, Dan woke before dawn, a habit drilled into him through decades of military service. Melissa's side of the bed remained undisturbed. She hadn't come home, or if she had, she'd slept elsewhere. The house was silent as he made his way downstairs to the kitchen, deciding to prepare breakfast for everyone like he used to on weekend mornings. As he reached for the refrigerator door, he noticed a stack of bills on the counter. Curious, he leafed through them, credit card statements with alarming balances, receipts for jewelry, designer clothing, spa treatments. One statement showed a $12,000 balance for a store he'd never heard of. Dan felt his military training kick in. Analyze the situation, assess the threat, develop a strategy. He opened his laptop and logged into their joint checking account. The balance that should have contained 6 months of his untouched salary showed less than $3,000 remaining. The savings account, which had held their emergency fund of $45,000, was down to a mere $7,200. Dan took a deep breath, controlling his reaction. A good analyst never jumped to conclusions without all the facts. He continued his investigation, methodically examining every financial record he could access. By the time he heard movement upstairs, a clear and disturbing picture had emerged. Justin shuffled into the kitchen around 10, looking surprised to find his father sitting at the island counter. "You're still here," he mumbled, reaching for the refrigerator. "Where else would I be?" Dan asked, keeping his tone light. "Thought I'd make pancakes like I used to. Remember Saturday morning pancakes?" Justin grabbed an energy drink, popping the top with practiced ease. "Whatever. I'm heading to Bryce's place. He's got a new gaming setup." "It's your first day with your dad back," Dan said, trying to hide his disappointment. "Maybe we could catch up? I'd like to hear about your basketball season." Justin snorted. "I quit basketball months ago. It's not exactly a career path, is it? Not like we need more minimum wage earners in this family." The barb was deliberate and aimed with precision. Dan felt it land, but maintained his composure. "There's value in sports beyond the paycheck, son. Teamwork, discipline. Save the military pep talk, Justin interrupted, his tone dismissive. Brett says that kind of thinking is for people who can't make it in the real world. Brett. Dan inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mom's friend, Justin replied with a smirk that conveyed exactly what kind of friend Brett was. He's teaching me about investments and business. Real-world skills, not how to follow orders and get shot at for crap pay. Dan nodded slowly, absorbing this new information. And your mother encourages this mentorship? Brett's successful, Justin said with a shrug. He drives a Porsche and has a penthouse downtown. What were you doing at his age? Following some sergeant around and saying yes, sir, all day. At Justin's age, Dan had been completing his first tour overseas, but he kept that to himself. I'd like to meet this Brett sometime. You will, Justin said, heading for the door. He practically lives here when you're gone. Don't wait up, I'm sleeping at Bryce's. After Justin left, Emma appeared, headphones around her neck and phone in hand. She hesitated in the doorway, looking at Dan with an expression that hovered somewhere between embarrassment and uncertainty. Hey, Emma Bear, Dan said softly, using the nickname from her childhood. Dad, she acknowledged with a small nod. I'm going to meet some friends at the mall. I could drive you, Dan offered. Maybe we could grab lunch afterward? I've missed you, sweetheart. Emma looked down at her shoes. Mom's friend is picking me up. He's taking us shopping. Brett. Dan asked, keeping his voice steady. Emma nodded. He gets me stuff sometimes. Says I should have nice things. Before Dan could respond, a car horn sounded from the driveway. Emma hurried to the window. That's him. I gotta go. Emma, Dan called as she turned to leave. Are you happy? With everything, the way things are now. His daughter paused, her back to him. For a moment, Dan thought he saw her shoulders slump slightly. It's whatever, she said finally, the teenage dismissal barely concealing something deeper. Mom says we're upgrading our lives. Says we've spent too many years living like we're on a budget, when we don't have to. With that, she was gone, the front door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Dan moved to the window, watching as his 12-year-old daughter climbed into a convertible sports car. The driver was visible now, a man perhaps in his mid-30s with styled dark hair and designer sunglasses, one arm draped casually over the steering wheel. He smiled at Emma in a way that made Dan's protective instincts flare, then glanced toward the house. For a brief moment, the man's eyes met Dan's through the window, and his smile changed to something more challenging, a smirk of ownership, of territory marked. Then they were gone, the expensive car accelerating down the quiet suburban street with unnecessary speed. Dan stood at the window long after they'd disappeared, his mind working with the precision that had made him an exceptional military analyst. He had walked into an already established dynamic, his wife's affair, his children's allegiance shifted, his position as husband and father undermined systematically. The situation was clear. While he had been serving his country, someone else had been serving themselves to his family. The front door opened again, and Melissa entered, wearing the same clothes from the previous day. She froze when she saw Dan standing there. You're up early, she said, dropping her keys on the entryway table. Military habit, Dan replied evenly. Late night. Melissa's expression hardened. Don't start, Dan. I'm a grown woman. And I'm still your husband, last I checked. She laughed, the sound brittle and without humor. On paper, maybe. But let's be honest, you've been more married to the army than to me for years. That's not fair, Mel. We agreed on this life together. My service has provided for this family. Provided? She interrupted, gesturing around the house. This house? This life? You call this providing? Do you know what Brett makes in a month? More than you make in a year. And what exactly does Brett do? Dan asked, his tone carefully neutral. He's an investment consultant, Melissa said, lifting her chin defiantly. He helps people grow their money, secure their future. He doesn't disappear for months at a time to get shot at in some godforsaken desert. Dan nodded slowly. I see. And he helps you spend money too, apparently. Our accounts are nearly empty, Melissa. Don't exaggerate, she scoffed. I've been updating our lifestyle, that's all. We deserve nice things. $40,000 of nice things in 6 months. Her eyes narrowed. Are you monitoring my spending now? Controlling me? Brett says that's what men like you do when you feel your control slipping. You try to use money as a leash. Men like me? Dan repeated quietly. Obsolete men, Melissa clarified, the words precise and cruel. Men who think bravery and duty and honor pay the bills. They don't, Dan. Not anymore. Brett is the future, smart, connected, ambitious. You're a relic. The words were calculated to wound, and they found their mark. Dan had spent his adult life in service to ideals he believed in deeply. To hear them dismissed so casually by the woman who had once supported him was disorienting. I see, he said finally. And the kids? You've convinced them of this worldview too. Melissa shrugged. They're smart. They can see which path leads to success. Justin worships Brett. Says he wants to be like him someday. And Emma. Well, Brett treats her like a princess. Buys her whatever she wants, takes her places. When was the last time you could do that? There's more to parenting than buying things, Melissa. There's guidance, values. Values don't buy college tuition or designer clothes, she interrupted. Face it, Dan. You're outmatched here. Brett is everything you're not. Successful, present, exciting. Dan considered his wife carefully, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The woman before him was a stranger wearing Melissa's face, speaking with Melissa's voice, but none of her heart. You really believe that, he said softly. It wasn't a question. I do, she confirmed. And the sooner you accept it, the easier this will be. Brett thinks you should retire. Take that security consultant job at the mall you were talking about last year. It's more your speed. The mention of the mall security position, a joke Dan had made about his post-retirement options, revealed just how thoroughly she had dismissed his capabilities. 20 years of elite military service, specialized training, advanced degrees in international relations and conflict resolution, fluency in 4 languages, and she thought his ceiling was checking shoplifters. I see, Dan said again, his voice steady. And what does Brett suggest I do with my pension? Hand it over to him for investment? Melissa's slight flinch told him he'd struck close to a conversation that had already occurred. Don't be ridiculous, she said, but the conviction had left her voice. I'm going to shower and change. Some of us have places to be today. As she climbed the stairs, Dan remained in the entryway, a new clarity settling over him. This wasn't just about an affair or midlife restlessness. This had the hallmarks of something more calculated. Brett, whoever he was, had systematically inserted himself into every aspect of the Harris family, financial, emotional, parental. The pattern was too thorough, too efficient to be coincidental. Dan walked to his study, a small room off the living room that had remained largely untouched during his absence. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop again, this time not to check family finances, but to activate a different skill set entirely. Master Sergeant Daniel Harris might look like just another middle-aged soldier to his wife and her lover. They saw the uniform, the regulations, the predictable routine of military life, and mistook it for the sum total of the man. What they didn't see, what most people never saw, was that Dan's real value to the military had never been his ability to follow orders. It had been his exceptional talent for intelligence analysis, strategic assessment, and high-stakes negotiation. The kind of skills that could dismantle terrorist networks. The kind of skills that could resolve tribal conflicts that had persisted for generations. The kind of skills that could expose a fraud like Brett. Dan's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. It was time to gather intelligence on the enemy who had invaded his home. And if there was one thing Daniel Harris excelled at, it was understanding his opponents better than they understood themselves. The first battle might have gone to Brett, but Dan was playing a longer game. And he was very, very good at the long game. Part 3. The Investigation. For the next 2 weeks, Dan maintained a careful facade of defeated acceptance. He returned to his base duties, reporting daily to Fort Hood, where he had been reassigned to a training role until his retirement. At home, he was cordial but distant with Melissa, who seemed relieved that he wasn't fighting harder for their marriage. He made attempts to connect with his children, who remained aloof but marginally less hostile as days passed. All the while, his real work happened in the background. Brett Collins, as he called himself, maintained a sleek website advertising his services as an elite investment consultant to discerning high-net-worth individuals. His online presence was polished and professional, with testimonials from satisfied clients and photos of Brett in expensive suits standing beside luxury cars and private jets. To the untrained eye, he appeared legitimate, successful, established, trustworthy. But Dan had spent decades seeing through facades. The first red flag was the complete absence of regulatory information on Brett's website. No SEC registration, no FINRA broker number, no state licenses. Every legitimate financial advisor in America operated under strict regulatory frameworks. Brett's materials carefully avoided mentioning any of them. Dan ran Brett's image through facial recognition software he still had access to through military channels. The search returned multiple hits under different names. Brett Collins, yes, but also Brian Carter, Benjamin Caldwell, and Brandon Covington. 4 identities, 4 cities, 4 similar investment schemes. Next came background checks through contacts Dan had cultivated over years of service. Brett's current identity had been established only 3 years ago. Before that, the man simply didn't exist, at least not under that name. His claimed Harvard Business School degree? No record of attendance. His mentions of growing up in Connecticut? The address he'd referenced belonged to a shopping mall. Dan compiled his findings methodically, building a comprehensive profile. Brett Collins was a professional confidence man who specialized in targeting affluent women, particularly those with absent or inattentive husbands. He would integrate himself into their lives, encourage lavish spending and lifestyle upgrades, then position himself to control their finances. Eventually, he would drain their accounts and disappear, leaving behind devastation and debt. The pattern was textbook. Melissa, with her military husband deployed overseas and her growing dissatisfaction with suburban life, had been the perfect target. But Dan's most significant discovery came 3 weeks into his investigation, when he learned that Brett Collins was currently under FBI surveillance in connection with a multi-state financial fraud investigation. The man courting his wife and influencing his children wasn't just a con artist. He was an active subject of federal interest, suspected of defrauding at least 12 victims across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Armed with this intelligence, Dan could have immediately exposed Brett, but the strategist in him recognized that timing was everything. Brett had spent months embedding himself in the Harris family. If Dan moved too quickly, Melissa might dismiss the evidence as jealousy or manipulation. The children, already aligned with Brett, might further reject their father. No, this required precision, careful planning, the right moment. That moment arrived unexpectedly on a Friday evening when Melissa announced over dinner, a rare occasion when all 4 family members were present, that Brett had invited them all to join him the following night at La Maison, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Dallas. He specifically asked that you come, Dan, Melissa said, unable to hide her surprise. Says it's time you two got better acquainted, man to man. Justin looked up from his phone, suddenly interested. Brett never invites people to La Maison unless it's a special occasion. Do you think he's going to announce something, Mom? Melissa blushed slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Emma studied her plate. He took his last girlfriend there before he proposed. I saw it on his Instagram memories. Dan kept his expression neutral as the pieces fell into place. Brett was accelerating his timeline, preparing to formalize his position in the family, which meant he was also likely preparing for the next phase of his scheme. I'd be honored to join you all, Dan said mildly. I've been wanting to get to know Brett better. Melissa looked at him suspiciously. Really? You're not going to make a scene? Why would I? Dan asked, his tone reasonable. It's clear that Brett is important to this family. I should understand why, shouldn't I? Later that night, Dan made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Special Agent Vanessa Martinez at the FBI's Dallas field office, a woman whose brother Dan had served with in Afghanistan. The second was to Michael Chun, the owner of La Maison and a former Marine whose restaurant had become the elite gathering spot for Dallas society, thanks in part to early investment from veteran-supporting business groups that Dan had connected him with. By Saturday evening, all the pieces were in place. Brett had reserved the most prominent table at La Maison, positioned perfectly so that other diners could observe the party without appearing to stare. Dan arrived separately from his family, having told Melissa he needed to finish some paperwork at the base. When he entered the restaurant, he saw them already seated, Brett at the head of the table, Melissa to his right, the children opposite her, with an empty chair clearly left for Dan. Brett Collins cut an impressive figure in a custom suit that probably cost more than Dan's monthly salary. His dark hair was expertly styled, his watch a gleaming Patek Philippe, his smile practiced and confident as he rose to greet Dan. "The man of the hour," Brett said, extending his hand. "Master Sergeant Harris, I presume." Dan shook his hand firmly. "Just Dan is fine, Brett. Thank you for the invitation." "My pleasure," Brett replied smoothly. "I thought it was time we all got acquainted properly. After all, we're practically family at this point." The meal progressed with Brett holding court, regaling them with stories of business triumphs and celebrity encounters. He ordered the most expensive items on the menu without consulting the prices, selected a $2,000 bottle of wine with ostentatious expertise, and repeatedly referenced his various properties and investments. Throughout it all, Melissa gazed at him adoringly while the children hung on his every word. "I've been helping Justin understand the fundamentals of market dynamics," Brett explained to Dan between courses. "The boy has a natural gift for seeing opportunities. Unlike the traditional career paths some might push him toward, I'm showing him how real wealth is created." "Fascinating," Dan replied. "And what exactly is your background in finance, Brett? Where did you receive your training?" A flicker of something, annoyance? Concern crossed Brett's face before his smile returned. "Harvard Business School, class of '08. Worked at Goldman for a few years before striking out on my own. The institutional path is too limiting for someone with my approach to wealth creation." Dan nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine so. And your client base, all local to Dallas?" "I maintain a carefully selected portfolio of clients across the Southwest," Brett replied, his tone suggesting he was doing these clients a favor by managing their money. "In fact, I've been talking with Melissa about some exciting opportunities one typically reserved for my premium clients." "Oh." Dan raised an eyebrow. Melissa jumped in enthusiastically. "Brett thinks we should leverage your military pension for his Pinnacle Fund. The returns are incredible, Dan. People are doubling their investments in months." "Remarkable," Dan said mildly. "I'd love to see the prospectus on that." Brett waved a dismissive hand. "It's a private placement, very exclusive. Not the kind of thing with glossy brochures. It's about relationships and trust." "Of course," Dan agreed. "Trust is essential." As the main course was cleared, Brett tapped his glass with a knife, drawing the attention of nearby tables as well as their own. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, his voice pitched to carry just far enough. "These past months getting to know Melissa, Justin, and Emma have been transformative for me. I've come to think of them as the family I never had." Melissa's eyes glistened with tears as Brett reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I know this is unorthodox with Dan here and all," Brett continued, playing to his audience, "but I believe in openness and honesty. Melissa, I want you in my life permanently. I'll take care of all the messy details," he added with a pointed glance at Dan, "but I need to know if you'll be mine." He opened the box, revealing a diamond ring of staggering proportions. Gasps sounded from nearby tables. Emma's eyes widened. Justin nodded approvingly. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. "Brett, Before you answer," Dan interrupted calmly, "I think there are some people you should meet, Brett. Or should I say, Brian? Benjamin? Brandon?" Brett's expression froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." Dan checked his watch. Right on time. At that moment, Michael Chun appeared at their table, accompanied by a woman in a sharp business suit and two men in plain clothes with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Special Agent Martinez, Dan said by way of greeting. Thank you for joining us. Daniel, the FBI agent nodded. Is this our person of interest? Brett's face had drained of color. He stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Melissa, we're leaving. Mr. Collins, Agent Martinez said firmly. I have some questions regarding financial activities conducted under your name and several aliases across 3 states. We can discuss this here or at our field office. Your choice. What is happening? Melissa demanded, looking between Brett and Dan in confusion. Dan's voice remained steady. Brett, or whatever his real name is a con artist, Mel. He's under federal investigation for fraud. He's done this before in Oklahoma City, in Houston, in Shreveport. He finds vulnerable women, integrates himself into their lives, drains their finances, and disappears. That's absurd, Brett sputtered, though his confident demeanor had vanished. Melissa, he's jealous, trying to sabotage us. Don't listen to this nonsense. It's not nonsense, Dan continued, removing a folder from his jacket and placing it on the table. This contains evidence of at least 12 instances of identity fraud, wire fraud, and investment scams. It also includes documentation of the accounts you've opened in Melissa's name, accounts she knows nothing about, with over $200,000 in debt already accumulated. Melissa stared at the folder, then at Brett. What accounts? What is he talking about? Brett's expression hardened as he realized the situation was unsalvageable. With remarkable speed, he grabbed his jacket and attempted to push past Agent Martinez, only to find his path blocked by her colleagues. Daniel Allen Harris, Brett sneered, switching tactics. You think you're so clever with your military background and Boy Scout honor. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections you can't imagine. Dan smiled slightly. Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Gregory Allen Mercer, born in Atlantic City, 1985. 3 outstanding warrants, wanted in connection with financial crimes in multiple jurisdictions. And I suspect the FBI is very interested in those connections you mentioned. At the use of his real name, the last of Brett's facade crumbled. Agent Martinez stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Gregory Mercer, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As Mercer was led away, the restaurant had fallen silent, every diner watching the drama unfold. Justin and Emma sat frozen, expressions of shock and dawning comprehension on their young faces. Melissa stared at the folder Dan had placed on the table, her hands trembling as she reached for it. How? She began, her voice barely audible. I'm not just a soldier, Mel, Dan said quietly. I never was. My job for the past 15 years has been intelligence analysis and high-level negotiation. I'm trained to see through deception, to identify patterns, to understand motivations better than people understand themselves. He opened the folder, showing her documentation of accounts opened in her name, loans secured against their house without her knowledge, credit lines maxed out and funneled into offshore accounts. He was going to take everything, Dan explained gently. After the proposal, he would have convinced you to liquidate assets, combine finances. Within months, he would have disappeared, leaving you with nothing but debt. It's what he's done before, at least 12 times that we know of. Melissa's face crumpled as the truth sank in. Tears spilled down her cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I've been such a fool. You were targeted, Dan corrected, by a professional. It's what he does. Justin, who had idolized Brett for months, looked shell-shocked. He was teaching me about investments. He said I could intern at his firm next summer. None of it was real, Dan told his son. The firms, the investments, the returns, all fabricated. Emma reached across the table for her mother's hand. I'm sorry, Mom. I thought he was so cool. The family sat in stunned silence as the restaurant gradually returned to its normal hum of conversation, though with frequent glances toward their table. The elaborate meal Brett had ordered sat forgotten before them. What happens now? Melissa asked finally, her voice small. Dan closed the folder and signaled for the check. Now we go home and begin to sort through the financial damage. It won't be easy, but we'll manage. How can you be so calm? She demanded, a flash of the anger that had characterized their recent interactions returning. After how I treated you, how I spoke to you? Because I understand, Dan said simply. I understand how manipulation works, how people can be led to believe things, to feel things that aren't grounded in reality. It's what I've studied for 2 decades. When the check arrived, Michael Chun intercepted it. On the house, Master Sergeant. It's the least I can do for the man who helped me get started. Dan thanked him with a nod, then stood. Let's go home. We have a lot to talk about. As they left the restaurant, a huddle of stunned Harises following Dan's confident stride. They were unaware that they were being observed by several individuals scattered throughout the dining room. Journalists who had been tipped off about a dramatic arrest at Dallas's most exclusive restaurant. By morning, the story of how decorated intelligence operative Master Sergeant Daniel Harris had exposed a multi-state fraud operation to protect his family would be making headlines. And by Monday, the phone calls would begin. Private security firms, defense contractors, and intelligence agencies suddenly very interested in the post-retirement plans of a man whose analytical and strategic capabilities had been publicly demonstrated in such spectacular fashion. The battle for his family had been won. Now, the next chapter of Dan Harris's career was about to begin. Part 4. Redemption and Renewal. 6 months after the dramatic events at La Maison, the Harris family home in Richardson bore little resemblance to the cold, divided space Dan had returned to from deployment. Gone were the ostentatious decorations and expensive furniture purchased during Brett's, Gregory Mercer's, influence. In their place was a comfortable, lived-in home with photographs of family moments covering the walls. Dan sat at the kitchen table, reviewing documents for Harris Strategic Solutions, the consulting firm he had established 3 months earlier after declining numerous offers from government contractors. His military retirement had processed smoothly, closing 22 years of distinguished service and opening a new chapter that, ironically, utilized his true skills far more effectively than his military role ever had. The publicity surrounding Mercer's arrest had led to unexpected opportunities. Dan's ability to systematically dismantle a sophisticated con artist had demonstrated his analytical capabilities in a way that classified military operations never could. Within weeks, he had received consulting requests from corporations, financial institutions, and even foreign governments seeking his expertise in threat assessment and strategic intelligence. Harris Strategic now occupied a sleek office in downtown Dallas, employed 11 people, and had a client waitlist 6 months long. The firm specialized in identifying vulnerabilities in corporate structures, in security systems, in financial operations, before they could be exploited. Dan's military background gave him credibility. His recently demonstrated skills gave him relevance. Dad. Justin stood in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. At 17, he still carried himself with teenage awkwardness. But the dismissive arrogance Brett had cultivated had been replaced by something more thoughtful. I was wondering if that internship offer is still open? Dan looked up, surprised. He had mentioned the possibility of Justin working at his firm during the summer, but his son had been noncommittal, still processing the betrayal of his former mentor. Absolutely, Dan said, careful to keep his tone casual despite his inner surge of hope. We've got a new project analyzing social engineering vulnerabilities for a tech company. Could use someone who understands how younger users think. Justin nodded, shifting his weight. Cool. I've been talking to Mrs. Rodriguez about college programs in cybersecurity and intelligence analysis. She says I might have an aptitude for it. Dan hid his smile. Justin's guidance counselor had been saying the same thing for years, but coming from Brett, the advice had carried weight. Coming from his father, it had been dismissed. Some wounds healed slowly. You definitely would, Dan agreed. Drop by the office Monday after school? I'll introduce you to the team. Justin nodded again, hesitating before adding, that stuff you did, figuring out Mercer. That was pretty badass, Dad. Before Dan could respond, Justin had disappeared upstairs, the rare compliment hanging in the air like a precious gift. The front door opened and Emma entered, returning from her weekend STEM camp. Another change in the household. Where Brett had encouraged designer clothes and mall trips, the post-Mercer Emma had discovered a passion for robotics and engineering that Dan enthusiastically supported. "Dad," she called, dropping her duffel bag in the hallway. "Our team qualified for the state championships. We built this automated wildlife tracking system that uses thermal imaging, and the judges said it was the most innovative approach they'd seen from middle schoolers." Dan rose to greet her, accepting her enthusiastic hug, another post-Mercer development that he treasured. "That's incredible, Emma Bear. Tell me everything." As Emma launched into a detailed explanation of her team's project, Dan marveled at the transformation. 6 months ago, she had barely acknowledged his existence. Now, she sought his input, his approval, his support. The genuine interest he showed in her work, so different from Brett's superficial attention and material gifts, had gradually rebuilt their connection. "Where's Mom?" Emma asked, finally pausing for breath. "Meeting with her lawyer," Dan replied. "Finalizing the divorce papers." The brightness in Emma's eyes dimmed slightly. "Oh, right." The divorce had been Melissa's decision, made 3 months after Mercer's arrest. Despite the family's gradual healing, the marriage itself had proven beyond repair. Too much had been said, too many wounds inflicted. The Brett affair had been a symptom, not the cause, of a relationship that had quietly fractured years before Dan's final deployment. "It's okay, Emma," Dan assured her gently. "Your mom and I are in a good place now. We're better as co-parents than as husband and wife." This was true. After the initial shock and shame of the Mercer deception had worn off, Melissa had done the difficult work of examining how she had become vulnerable to his manipulation. She had returned to school, pursuing the psychology degree she had abandoned when Justin was born, and now worked part-time at a community counseling center while she completed her studies. The financial damage Mercer had caused was substantial but not catastrophic. Dan's new business had quickly surpassed his military income, allowing them to address the debts and begin rebuilding. More importantly, Melissa and Dan had found a way to communicate honestly about money, about parenting, about the future, all the conversations they had avoided during their marriage. The doorbell rang, interrupting Emma's renewed description of her robotics triumph. Dan answered it to find Melissa on the porch, her expression calm but serious. "Come in," he offered, stepping aside. "Emma was just telling me about the robotics competition." Melissa entered, smiling at their daughter. "Your coach called me. Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Emma beamed, accepting her mother's hug before excusing herself to call a teammate about a design modification she'd been considering. When they were alone, Melissa handed Dan a manila envelope. "It's done. Signed and filed." Dan took the envelope, feeling a complex mix of sadness and relief. "How are you feeling about it?" "Sad," she admitted. "Relieved. Grateful. Grateful." Melissa met his eyes directly, something she had struggled to do in the aftermath of Mercer's arrest. "Yes, grateful. For what you did, how you handled everything. You could have exposed him immediately, humiliated me publicly. You could have fought for custody, used my terrible judgment against me. You didn't." Dan shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "That wouldn't have helped anyone, especially the kids." "Still," she insisted, "most men wouldn't have been so strategic." The word hung between them, a reminder of how thoroughly she had misunderstood his capabilities during their marriage. "Dr. Williams says I was attracted to Mercer because he represented everything I thought was missing in our life," Melissa continued, referring to her therapist. "The excitement, the status, the visible success. I never understood what you really did I? All those deployments, all those late nights at the base. I thought you were just following orders, being a good soldier." "I never really explained it," Dan acknowledged. "Security clearances compartmentalized information. It became easier not to talk about work at all." "And I never asked," Melissa added. "Not really. I just assumed." The conversation represented the new equilibrium they had reached, honest, respectful, aware of past mistakes, without being mired in them. The love that had once bound them had transformed into something different but still valuable: mutual respect and commitment to their children's well-being. "Will you be at Justin's game on Thursday?" Dan asked, changing the subject. Justin had returned to basketball after Mercer's influence waned, rediscovering his passion for the sport. "Wouldn't miss it," Melissa confirmed. "Dr. Williams rescheduled our session specifically so I could attend." After Melissa left, Dan returned to his work, but found his thoughts drifting to how profoundly his life had changed in a single year. From the silent desert outpost where he had negotiated tribal peace agreements, to the cold homecoming that had greeted him, to the systematic dismantling of Gregory Mercer's scheme, to the unexpected launch of a thriving business. It had been a journey no military training could have fully prepared him for. His phone rang, displaying the name of his newest and most significant client, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "Harris," he answered crisply. "Dan, it's Martinez." Special Agent Vanessa Martinez had become both a valued professional contact and a friend in the months since Mercer's arrest. "Got some news you might want to hear in person. Free for coffee tomorrow." "Brief me now," Dan requested, his analyst's mind already anticipating various scenarios. "Mercer rolled on his network," Martinez said, professional satisfaction evident in her voice. "Gave us names, dates, account information on at least 15 other operators running similar schemes across the country. Your profile model was spot on. They all target the same demographic, use the same approach. We've already made 3 arrests, with more coming." Dan allowed himself a moment of professional pride. The psychological and operational profile he had developed of Mercer had proven applicable to others in his network, giving the FBI a valuable tool for identifying and intercepting similar predators before they could devastate more families. "Good work," he said simply. "Your work," Martinez corrected. "The assistant director wants to discuss expanding your consulting role. This is big, Dan. Potential to prevent thousands of cases like what happened to your family." After ending the call, Dan sat quietly, contemplating this new development. The pain Melissa and his children had experienced might now serve a greater purpose, protecting other families from similar predators. It didn't erase the damage done, but it gave it meaning beyond their personal tragedy. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Justin appeared in the doorway again, his expression tentative. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always," Dan replied, setting aside his work. Justin hesitated, then committed. "How did you know?" "About Mercer, I mean. What were the signs that we all missed?" It was the first time Justin had directly asked about Dan's methods, the first genuine interest he'd shown in his father's expertise. Dan recognized it for the opening it was, not just a question about Mercer, but an invitation to understand his father. "Sit down," Dan offered, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'll walk you through it." As he began explaining the analytical process he had used, the identification of discrepancies, the pattern recognition, the strategic patience required to build a comprehensive case, Dan saw something kindle in his son's eyes. Not the false admiration Brett had cultivated by flashing wealth and status, but a genuine respect born of understanding. This, Dan realized, was his most important victory. Not the exposure of a con man, not the successful business, not even the FBI contract that would help protect countless families. His true triumph was sitting across the kitchen table, leaning forward with genuine interest, seeing his father clearly for perhaps the first time. In the analytical terminology Dan had used throughout his military career, it represented the ultimate strategic objective achieved. In the simpler language of fatherhood, it was everything that mattered. 3 years later, Dan stood at the podium of a Dallas business conference, concluding his keynote address on strategic threat assessment in the digital age. His company, Harris Strategic Solutions, had grown to 75 employees with offices in 3 cities. The FBI contract had expanded into relationships with multiple federal agencies, financial institutions, and international organizations focused on fighting various forms of fraud. Justin, now a sophomore at Georgetown University studying international security, sat in the front row beside Emma, a high school junior already fielding early interest from MIT's engineering program. Both had flown in specifically for this event, Justin from Washington, Emma from her summer science program at Stanford. As the audience applauded, Dan spotted Melissa near the back of the hall. They exchanged small nods of acknowledgement, their new normal. She had completed her psychology degree and now counseled families recovering from financial fraud, her personal experience informing her professional approach. Their divorce had finalized 3 years ago, but they had managed to forge a new type of partnership focused entirely on their children's well-being. After the presentation, as attendees networked over coffee, Dan found himself approached by a young military officer in dress uniform. "Master Sergeant Harris," the lieutenant said, extending her hand. "Lieutenant Rebecca Fowler, Army Intelligence. Your work has become required reading in our advanced analysis courses." Dan shook her hand, still occasionally surprised by his transition from behind-the-scenes analyst to public figure in his field. "Glad to hear the military is incorporating these methods. Sir, if I may," the lieutenant continued, "your case study on the Mercer Network has changed how we approach threat assessment. That methodical deconstruction of his operation, it's become the template for identifying non-traditional security threats." Dan nodded, accepting the compliment professionally. The best analysts recognize that threats don't always carry weapons or make explicit demands. Sometimes they come bearing gifts and warm smiles. As the lieutenant moved on, Dan was joined by his children. Justin, already tall and confident in a way that reminded Dan of himself at that age, clapped him on the shoulder. "Impressive, Dad. Though you left out the part where Mercer cried when the FBI took him away." Dan chuckled. That seemed unnecessarily dramatic for a business presentation. Emma, brilliant and observant, studied her father thoughtfully. "I was thinking about something during your talk. When you came home that day, when everything was so messed up, you could have just left. Mom was terrible to you. We were awful. And you knew within days what was happening. But you stayed and fixed it. Why?" Dan considered his daughter's question carefully. "Because that's what I was trained to do, Emma. Not just as a soldier, but as an analyst, a strategist, and as a father. When you identify a threat to something you value, you don't retreat. You assess, you plan, and you engage." "Like a mission," Justin nodded. "No," Dan corrected gently. "Like a family." As they walked together toward the exit, Dan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The painful homecoming that had revealed the fractures in his family. The systematic campaign to reclaim what mattered most. The unexpected professional renaissance that had emerged from personal crisis. It hadn't been the retirement he had envisioned during those long nights in desert outposts or mountain-forward operating bases. It was something both harder and more rewarding. A second act that utilized everything he had learned during his military career, while adding dimensions he hadn't known he possessed. Master Sergeant Daniel Harris had spent his military career analyzing threats, negotiating peace, and protecting American interests abroad. Daniel Harris, civilian, father, and founder of Harris Strategic Solutions, now used those same skills to protect families, businesses, and institutions from threats that wore designer suits instead of enemy uniforms. Different battlefields. Same warrior. Different challenges. Same analytical mind. Different family structure. Same unwavering commitment. As they stepped into the Texas sunshine, Dan placed one arm around each of his children, feeling a contentment that no military commendation had ever provided. The unseen hero had finally been recognized, not just by the business world or government agencies, but by the people who mattered most. And that, Dan reflected as they walked together toward whatever came next, was the most meaningful victory of all. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible content.